So today I prepared just a quick FRQ overview for those of you that either missed class or need more of an example for our midterm. So one of the things that we had talked about in class is what is an FRQ. So real quick, it's like an essay. Typically there's some sort of prompt or scenario where you need to use your psych knowledge. A lot of times terms are listed and you have to use them in some manner. Other times the prompt might just ask you to identify different elements of a concept they give you or a study they give you or something like that. On the AP test in May, there are 2 FRQs. You'll have 50 minutes to respond to both. So obviously in order to be successful, you need to be familiar with the information, practice, and kind of have an expectation going into it. So what shouldn't you do on the FRQ? Don't freak out. You can't control what's going to be on it. You don't have to know all of it. You have to know some of it. So work with what you know. Don't necessarily go in the order that is listed within the question, because if you don't know something, then why would you start with it? Why would you waste your time with it? So you can either start, let's say, in question 1 with the terms that you're most familiar with, or maybe you're going to start with question 2 because you look at question 1 and you're like, wow, I really can't handle that. So obviously you want to divide your time up about half and half, about 25 and 25, but keep in mind that obviously you want to go in the order of things that you know while you keep both questions separate. There are no transitions, introductions, or conclusions. That's a waste of your time, so don't spend time writing those things. Don't say things like, well, now that I've told you about Milgram's research, let me go into whatever the next term is. That's just a waste of a sentence. So it's very scientific, it's very specific. Don't waste time, spacer writing unless it's going to earn you a point. Don't contradict yourself, especially not immediately, and don't bullet point or outline your answer. Your answer should be written in paragraph form, indented. It's just that each paragraph is essentially organized around one of the key concepts from the prompt. What you should do on an FRQ: read through the questions and determine what you're being asked. Maybe even underline what you're being asked or circle, so that if it's asking you to come up with a specific example, or asking you for an example and then the impact on the scenario, or whatever it might be, you can be very clear in your response. Always a good idea to take a minute or two to jot down keywords or concepts that you don't want to forget as you write, because once you jump in, you're probably going to be moving very quickly. I would jump right into the question being asked. I always suggest that each time you are responding to the prompt or you're using a term, you DEA, which means define, explain, apply. Explain just means if you can add one sentence to expand upon the definition a little bit, then you should. If the definition doesn't really require any explanation, if it's pretty self-explanatory to everyone, if it's a very clear definition, then don't explain. And then the apply part means apply the term back to the prompt or give an example, whatever it is that it's asking you to do. It's giving you a prompt for a reason, so make sure you're either tying it back to the term or to the prompt in any way that you need to. The next thing that I like to recommend is if you're given a prompt that maybe lists 6 to 8 words or something like that, and you're coming up with your own specific example of each one of those terms, it's a good idea to define, explain, give your example, and then your last sentence, just to make it clear, would be tying your example back to the definition. So saying something like, this demonstrates proactive interference because. That can make it very clear to the reader that you know what you're talking about. Because sometimes when you give an example, it could be an example of 5 different psych terms. So we're going to need to know if we want to know that you're mastered it, we're going to want to know that that example demonstrates that term and you clearly understand why. So that can be a really good habit to get into. Other tips. I've already said this. If you don't know a term too well, maybe leave it and move on. You can leave space and come back to it. If you realize you forgot to put something in, maybe put a little asterisk where you forgot it, or put C end in parentheses, and then at the end of the question, add in what you wanted to say. So if you're reading through it and you're like, oh man, I didn't say that, make sure that you add it in at the end of that question. Try to write neatly and breathe, especially those of you with test-taking anxiety. Make sure you're taking the time to breathe and focus yourself. So let's practice. Here I've given you a scenario that I want you to read through. Once you read through it, I'd like you to take the time to try to write, DEA, write your response, and I think you should pause the video while you give yourself time to practice, because the next slide is going to jump right into the rubric. So now that you've taken the time to go through and write what you feel your response would be, the first slide I've included is what a rubric might typically look like for this example. So for the cognitive theory, you need to explain the approach correctly. So obviously give a definition of it. You might use words like encode, process, store, retrieve. You wouldn't typically have to, but those would be good academic vocabulary or words to include. Then you must refer to specifics of Matilda's situation as the approach would explain it. An example is listed here. So make sure that you take time to read through each one of these. Now this would just be things that would score on the rubric, but it really doesn't provide you with an example. What I've done on this slide is from part 2, I've given you a sample response. Doesn't mean this is an ideal sample response. These weren't even great terms for me to include, but I just threw them on there, so you had to work with them. So you can see color-coded the define, the explain, and the apply parts. In this, it didn't ask you to come up with a random example. It asked you to use the term and respond specifically to Matilda's situation by giving an example of something she might experience. So you can read here, I give a definition, I give an explanation, and then I give exactly what they were asking me to do. This might vary a lot between people. So in Matilda's situation, if she's intimidated or struggling in her classes, she might be continually stressed out, which is causing her sympathetic to constantly keep her on alert. Then you could go anywhere with this. This might make her seem less approachable and somewhat uptight to others, which could impact her lack of social connections or ability to focus. You could have said anything else. You could say that her sympathetic nervous system constantly being on alert is wearing her down, which gives her no energy to go out and meet new people. So there are lots of different directions you can go with this, as long as it's accurate and it's tied to something given to you in the prompt. You don't want to introduce new things because it's not asking you to. In another FRQ, it might ask you to come up with an example and you might not have to tie it to the prompt. That's great. Then you can come up with any example that you want, and in that case, you just want to tie it back to the term.